I know the people who have been impacted by uranium mining and by the fallout and nuclear testing. And so it's not abstract, it's real. These are people I know, these are families I know. You can't ignore it as something that happened far away. This is our reality.
That's the voice of United States Congresswoman Teresa Leger Fernandez, representative for New Mexico's 3rd District. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are today's co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Dr. Doreen Horschig.
Welcome back to Press the Button. We mark the 76th anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki this week. With me is our Hale Fellow, Dr. Doreen Horschig, who is stepping in for my co-host, Tom Kalina, who is on a well-deserved vacation.
Hi, Michelle. It's always a pleasure to be on the pod, especially during this week that carries so much weight in the nuclear security community. Interestingly, the Physicians for Social Responsibility counted 39 anniversary events across the United States to commemorate the events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These efforts not only remember those who lost their lives, but they also signal the importance of nuclear disarmament. But let's dive into this week's nuclear news. What do you have for us on early warning?
We take a look at what's going on in Iran. Ibrahim Raisi has assumed Iran's presidency, but negotiations in Vienna to renew the Iranian nuclear deal are still on hold. So we discuss what is driving tensions in the Persian Gulf and how they might be able to be resolved. So stay tuned.
And after that, we hand the mic over to our guest host, Lilly Adams, founder of the Nuclear Voices Project and consultant at the Union of Concerned Scientists Global Security Program. She sits down with Representative Leger Fernandez. They talk about the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which is also known as RECA, that currently offers partial one-time compensation to some civilians and veterans exposed to radiation from nuclear testing. Fernandez is the 17th generation Northern New Mexican, and this issue directly impacts the Latin and indigenous communities in New Mexico. She explains how her history has influenced the approach to these important issues. And if you want to hear how you can support her efforts, including those located outside of New Mexico, please tune into today's show.
And finally, I answer a question on the biggest misconceptions about nuclear weapons on this week's Q&A segment. Remember, if you want your question answered on the air, shoot us a DM at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org.
If you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Every little bit helps to grow our show and our audience, and we really appreciate it. But with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Today I'm joined by Dina Esfandiary, Senior Advisor on the Middle East and North Africa for International Crisis Group. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
As you know, we have 7 minutes to cover the week's nuclear and national security news, starting now. This past week, Ibrahim Raisi was inaugurated as the new Iranian president. In the meantime, we've seen rising tensions in the Persian Gulf and no movement on the JCPOA talks. What are the dynamics driving this?
So I think the first thing to note is that the Raisi election in Iran is going to be mainly a domestic issue. The country is struggling economically. There's going to be a succession issue coming up soon. So that's the main big thing in terms of his election. But obviously, it will have implications for Iran's foreign policy as well. Iran's strategy is unlikely to change much because the supreme leader decides what direction Iran takes in foreign policy, but the tone will change, and tone matters. And I think this is what's driving a lot of what we're seeing at the moment. Today, Iran is really setting the tone for Raisi's presidency. It's what we're seeing in the region is a warning not to mess with Iran after several years of maximum pressure. It's a way for Iran to pressure the West to return to the JCPOA and provide sanctions relief. It's a way for Iran to up the ante, to showcase what it can do, that it can conduct anywhere, anytime attacks to really firmly establish deterrence. So this is really what Iran is doing right now. It's laying the groundworks for the next 4 years of presidency under Raisi. It remains to be seen, though, whether this will be the tone of the whole presidency or whether it really is just Iran having a bit of tough rhetoric at the beginning before things settle down somewhat.
So, do you see negotiations on the nuclear file restarting anytime in the future? And what does all of this mean for the JCPOA?
So, it's clear there's a need to return to the JCPOA, even if we recognize that the JCPOA on its own may no longer be enough to curb Iran's program in a meaningful way, but it will lay the groundwork for further discussions for a potential expansion of the JCPOA and even discussions on other areas of concern when it comes to Iran. The reason why we had this pause over the last few weeks was because we were waiting for the new president to be inaugurated. He's now in place. He's also putting in place his cabinet, and his team is there. So they're ready to represent Iran at the negotiating table. So there should be at some point a return to the negotiating table. Raisi, during his campaign, pledged his commitment to the JCPOA and the process. The problem is not everybody across the conservative camp agrees with him. Some don't feel as strongly as he does when it comes to a return to the JCPOA. So his cabinet selection, the team he's going to build around him, will be a real indicator of what direction Iran will go in and whether we will have a return to the negotiations, firstly, and secondly, a fruitful negotiation, which means a real return to the JCPOA.
Is there anything that policymakers outside of Iran can do to de-escalate some of the tensions that we're seeing right now?
There are two levels on which we have to de-escalate these tensions. The first is in the nuclear field, and the second is on the regional front. In the nuclear space, obviously a return to the JCPOA would be ideal. But given that we seem to be struggling with that right now, at Crisis Group, we're advocating for a kind of stopgap measure of for lack of a better way of putting it, a JCPOA minus, which basically means a temporary capping of Iranian progress in return for some sanctions relief. So this could be anything like, capping Iranian enrichment above a certain threshold, capping advanced centrifuge work, and in exchange, Iran could have a set level of exports it was allowed to do, or it could receive some of its frozen assets in return. This wouldn't do much but buy time in order for everybody to come back and really start to once again renegotiate a JCPOA plus, which would effectively address some of our concerns. On the regional front, the only way to de-escalate tensions is through talks, discussions, either on a bilateral level or on a multilateral level. We're seeing it a little bit on a bilateral level, for example, between the Iranians and the Saudis or the Iranians and the Emiratis. All of this, even if it doesn't lead to anything concrete, is still good news because it just means that they will be able to pick up the phone and de-escalate when things start to get a little bit out of hand. On a multilateral track, what would be good is for discussions between all the countries in the Persian Gulf, so this includes the GCC states and Iran, to sit around the negotiating table and to conduct discussions on security issues in parallel to the discussions on the JCPOA. This is the only way that you're going to be able to manage the tensions that are likely to continue in the foreseeable future.
Dina, thank you so much. Where can our listeners go to learn more? You mentioned that Crisis Group has some recommendations.
Absolutely. Crisis Group has put together a report on all of these issues that has just come out. Please go to our website and check it out.
And with that, our 7 minutes are up. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm Lilly Adams, founder of the Nuclear Voices Project, consultant for the Union of Concerned Scientists Global Security Program, and today's guest host of Press the Button. Today, I'm sitting down with Representative Teresa Leger Fernandez, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from New Mexico's 3rd District. Congresswoman Leger Fernandez holds a leadership role with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus as freshman representative and serves as chair of the Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples of the United States for the 117th Congress. She is a 17th generation Northern New Mexican. Before coming to Congress, Representative Leger Fernandez worked as an attorney and advocate and won important legal battles to advance voting rights, promote tribal sovereignty, and protect the environment and water. Representative Leger Fernandez, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's so important to talk about these issues, and I appreciate being able to do so with you.
Thank you. I'd like to start by talking about the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA, which was established in 1990 and currently offers partial one-time compensation to some civilians and veterans exposed to radiation from nuclear testing and some uranium workers. You've really become a champion for RECA, leading efforts in the House to extend and expand the program. What made you want to take on this fight, and what are you hoping to accomplish?
I wanted to take on this fight because this impacts not just New Mexicans, but people elsewhere, right, who were exposed to radiation from testing, from the development of the weapons, and through no fault of their own, are now suffering the consequences. And we as a government who inflicted this harm cannot stand back and say, it's too bad, right? We must act. And we did act when we first passed RECA, but it is expiring. And so we need to take this moment and reauthorize the act, but also when we look at it, say, where is the act deficient and what do we need to do to make it better? Because anytime you're going to reauthorize something, look back, what worked, what didn't, where are its deficiencies. And that's what we're going to be doing here. For example, we are going to update the law to make sure that the compensation is larger. Right now it's $50,000. That's not sufficient. So we're going to raise it to $150,000. We're going to increase it so it serves those who have been impacted. It had a very limited area in where if you happen to be exposed in these certain counties, you got compensation. But we know that it's not just a few counties that were impacted. In New Mexico, there's an amazing Downwinders Coalition, and they talk about where that exposure fell, where that cloud of radiation fell. We need to make sure that they are all entitled to the compensation. Another area that bothered me tremendously was the fact that we didn't cover miners after 71, even though we continued to mine into the 90s here in New Mexico. So we have extended that eligibility as well.
Great, thank you. And I know from working on this issue for a little while and talking to these communities that this is such a personal issue for people. It impacts, their lives, their communities, their families. And your family has been in New Mexico for many generations. This directly impacts New Mexicans and especially Latinx and Indigenous communities. So how has your history in New Mexico influenced your approach to RECA?
I know the people who have been impacted by uranium mining and by the fallout and nuclear testing. And so it's not abstract, it's real. These are people I know, these are families I know. So you can't ignore it as something that happened far away. This is our reality. And so it, of course, motivates my advocacy on this, especially, I worked for 30 years for the Pueblo of Laguna. The Pueblo of Laguna had one of the largest uranium open pit mines in the world. So you can imagine the cancers that have impacted those families. And I know those families. I know the people they've lost. The Hispanos who were working in the areas where, that radiation cloud fell. I meet with them, I know them. And so it becomes more urgent, but I think it is equally as important if you happen to be in Vieques or in Guam or in other places, right? It's just, I happen to know the stories intimately.
Thank you for sharing that, local perspective as well. You mentioned that unless Congress acts, RECA will expire in just under a year. Why is it so important to prevent that from happening?
Well, across the country, there's been more than 51,000 people who filed RECA claims, but we know that there are many more who would be entitled to this compensation and who remain eligible, or in the process of filing. We cannot let them lose out. So we don't want to lose the opportunity to make sure that everybody who is eligible receives the relief that they are entitled to. And so that's what we're trying to do with the reauthorization. And as I said, and making it broader to make sure that it covers all of those who are impacted.
Right. And you mentioned earlier as well that, this is urgent. We need to act on this now. So what developments can we expect in the coming weeks and months? And what can listeners do to support your efforts, including those who might be outside of New Mexico or other directly impacted areas?
Well, this month, Senators Crapo and Senator Lujan and I plan to introduce the RECA Amendments Act to reauthorize and update the existing law. But everybody knows to pass something into law, we need to get broad support, broad bipartisan support, both in the Senate and the House. So if you're listening to this and if your heart is moved to address these issues, then call your senators and your representatives and let them know that you're supportive of addressing those people who are harmed by nuclear testing and uranium mining, and that we need to do right by them. Let them know that, have them support RECA.
Thank you. Very excited to see this bill move forward and for everyone listening to support that effort. Well, RECA is a huge issue in and of itself, but clearly there are so many issues that are important to you and to your constituents. So what other priorities are you working on right now?
Well, we have been working on many bills that address our climate, orphan well bills, because those orphan wells are spewing methane into the air and they're doing no good, right? They're just companies who walked away from their obligations to clean up those wells. We are hopeful that we will see some very good money to help clean up orphan wells. I also am trying to spend a lot of money thinking about a place like New Mexico and others where we have this beautiful place I call home, is also very dependent on fossil fuel for its revenues, for its state budget. So that's not to say we shouldn't clean up the mess and we shouldn't reduce fossil fuel production, but we should do it with clear-eyed knowledge of what are the effects going to be so we can address them. So I have a just transition for the Energy Communities Act, where we are going to be making sure that we do not harm those communities that have relied in the past on fossil fuel development for funding our schools. 90% of our schools funding comes from fossil fuel royalties. So we need to make sure that we don't make that all go away, and we need to reinvest in those communities so that those communities, and they're in New Mexico, they're Native American, they're Latino, Latina communities, that we do not let them down. And that we actually provide a way to transition to green energy, but also to a diversified economy. And so we're working on that. Some of the fun things I'm doing that is actually not dealing with energy, but dealing about who we are as a country and how we celebrate, is I have the Creative Economy Revitalization Act, the Build Back Beautifully, just like we did after the Depression, where we funded a lot of arts. Our artists have been severely impacted by the pandemic. 67% of them were out of work, and they're available. If we created a jobs program to say, let's paint those new murals and have those poems and those plays, and imagine it, the music in the parks that bring us together again, the way we did after the Depression. Think about all those beautiful murals you've seen. Well, we need to kind of fund that work now. So I have the Creative Economy Revitalization Act, the Build Back Beautiful bill. We will also be introducing now in August.
Thank you. I love that. Build Back Beautiful. It's very inspiring, and also just really appreciate the just transition work as well. Thanks for sharing that really important work. That is all the time that we have, but I just want to thank you again so much for your time today, Congresswoman, and thank you for your leadership on these really crucial issues.
Well, thank you, Lilly, for the conversation. I truly enjoyed it. And goodbye to everybody out there.
We get letters.
And now for everyone's favorite nuclear Q&A. Are you ready, Michelle?
Yes, I am. Go for it, Doreen.
This week's question comes from Jake from Richmond. Jake asks, what are the biggest misconceptions about nuclear weapons?
Hey, Jake, that's a really great question. There's a couple that come to mind, and they may not be what you expect. So I can think of three big ones off the bat. One, that the biggest misconception, nuclear weapons have solved most major conflicts since World War II, that they alone ended World War II and that they kept the peace during the Cold War and kept it from becoming an all-out war between the US and the Soviet Union. This first one, Alex Wallerstein actually talked about it on our podcast last year. And he highlighted, especially when it came to World War II, when we think about the end of the war, it was not just the bombings themselves and the devastation they caused. It was also the fact that the Soviet Union revoked their neutrality and attacked Manchuria, that there were increasing U.S. victories in the Pacific region and the blockade. I mean, this was not that these two bombs ended the major conflict. And that it was not a question of if Japan would surrender, but when and how. And when it comes to the Cold War, it is not so simple to say that nuclear weapons were the primary determining factor. There were lots of close calls on both the U.S. and Russian side. And this is not just about the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is about systems that failed, that interpreted what appeared to be attacks coming in that were not true. And there isn't conclusive data on whether or not having each country having such large arsenals led to the prevention of conflict or the exacerbation of certain lower level conflicts in other countries that are not just the Soviet Union or the United States. The second major one, you cannot survive a nuclear blast. To be clear, nuclear weapons are massively, indiscriminately devastating. There are many people who die as a result of a nuclear bombing. And they do cause huge loss of life. However, people do survive. The survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, the hibakusha, have been vocal over the past decades, speaking out against the use and continued existence of nuclear weapons. There's this really great tool online, Nuke Map, also, started by Alex Wallerstein, that shows how you may be affected as a result of a nuclear blast, given your proximity to any detonation. I think Hollywood can tend to present these things as, one nuclear weapons detonation leads to the annihilation of the planet. The reality is that our lives are likely to continue. And we would have to figure out how we move through the world, how we rebuild. And, it's so much better to not have to get to that point. I think the third misconception is that nuclear weapons are a theoretical harm, that because they have not been used in war since 1945, that they are just, a potential harm. And we're working to try to simply prevent that from happening. And I think the reality is far more complex. The production as you heard today on the podcast with Representative Fernandez, the testing of such weapons, all of these activities that around the creation, around the maintenance of these weapons leads to real harm right now to many communities, especially communities of color or those who are impoverished. There's also the question of how, the existence of nuclear weapons can exacerbate, lower levels of conflict in other places, or how, our negotiations with North Korea, because they're always focusing on just the nuclear aspect, prevents us from being able to address the other real harms that the North Korean government is committing against its people. So, I would say that nuclear weapons are not just a theoretical harm. They are a current and very real harm for many people around the world. And so, this leads to my final point of why are these misconceptions, I think, particularly damaging. I think all of them leave me, if I buy into them, they leave me feeling disaffected, disempowered, and really far away from what is really a very pressing issue. And all of those misconceptions rolled together would tell me that there is no reason for me to be working to reduce nuclear threats, that they are a fact of life and something we cannot control, almost like a natural part of our system. And the reality is they are not. And maybe this is the final and biggest misconception. We built them and we can take them apart. So we've already gotten rid of over 50,000 that used to exist in the world and no longer do. So in that sense, I would ask that these misconceptions don't keep you from actually taking part in our political systems and actually using the power that you have to make a difference.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Michelle. And thanks, Jake, for the question. And remember, if you want your question answered on the air, shoot us a DM at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@ploughshares.org.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited by Alex Hall in Washington, D.C., and Delphine Vigil in San Francisco. With research and assistance from Doreen Horschig and Harry Tarpey. Sound design and audio engineering by Michael Padilla at the Soundport Recording Studio in Grass Valley, California. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.